You're making a scene, Elisa. Let it go. David's voice, usually a warm anchor, now sounded thin, brittle over the thumping bass of the party. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed firmly on the polished wood floor. Beside him, Chloe, Elisa's best friend since middle school, rested a manicured hand lightly on his arm, her expression a mask of manufactured sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. Elisa felt the oxygen leave the room. The crowded loft, moments ago a celebration, dissolved into a blur of strangers' faces. She opened her mouth, but the betrayal was too massive, too sudden to articulate. Then, a low, resonant voice cut through the noise, silencing the immediate circle. She isn't making a scene. A man stepped from the shadows near the balcony. Tall, impeccably dressed, carrying an air of quiet, absolute authority. Alexander, the elusive CEO everyone whispered about. The Alpha King. He didn't spare David or Chloe a glance. He looked only at Elisa, extending a hand. Come with me. The air in the loft was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and spilled champagne. Elisa had spent hours getting ready for David's promotion party. She'd bought the emerald green dress specifically because he said it matched her eyes. Now, it felt like a costume for a tragic play she hadn't auditioned for. She stared at David's hand, the one not currently trapped by Chloe's delicate grip. A silver ring, a promise ring he'd given her 2 years ago, glinted under the track lighting. It felt impossibly heavy now, a lead weight on her finger. Let it go? Elisa finally managed, her voice trembling but gaining traction. David, she's wearing my earrings, the ones I let her borrow for her important meeting. Chloe touched the diamond studs, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before returning, brighter and more brittle. Elisa, please. It just happened. We didn't mean to hurt you. It was sudden. The word echoed in Elisa's mind. A 5-year relationship dismantled by sudden. She looked back at David. His jaw was clenched, his eyes still refusing to meet hers. He was a man who preferred spreadsheets to confrontation, predictability to passion. She had thought his steadiness was a virtue. Now, she saw it was merely cowardice. How long? Elisa asked, the question hanging in the sudden lull of the music as the DJ transitioned tracks. The silence was louder than the bass had been. David finally looked up, his expression a mix of guilt and irritation. Elisa, this isn't the place. People are staring. Let them stare, she replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper that carried further than a shout. How long? Chloe stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of David, a protective gesture that made Elisa nauseous. A few months. We tried to fight it, Elle. We really did. But you and David, you've been growing apart. You have to admit that. A few months. While she had been planning his surprise party, while they had been discussing moving in together. All of it. A lie built on the foundation of her best friend's deceit. The betrayal wasn't a sharp stab. It was a slow, crushing pressure that threatened to break her in half. She took a step back, the heel of her shoe catching on a stray power cord. She stumbled, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. The room seemed to tilt, the faces around her blurring into a judgmental collage. She braced herself for the fall, closing her eyes. But the fall never came. Instead, a firm, warm hand grasped her upper arm, steadying her. The grip was strong, uncompromising, yet surprisingly gentle. Elisa opened her eyes to find herself looking into a chest, clad in a bespoke charcoal suit. She looked up, past the crisp white collar, into eyes the color of storm clouds. Alexander Thorne. He was a ghost in the city's social circles, rarely seen, widely discussed. Rumors painted him as ruthless in business, cold in his personal life. The Alpha King was a moniker whispered in boardrooms, a testament to his dominance in the corporate world. He wasn't supposed to be at a mid-level manager's promotion party. Yet, here he was. "Steady," Alexander murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his chest and into the hand holding her. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the couple standing awkwardly a few feet away. David's face had drained of color. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the tracks and the train was already here. Chloe, however, puffed her chest out slightly, an involuntary reaction to the power radiating from the man beside Elisa. "Mr. Thorne," David began, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't realize you were—" "Obviously," Alexander cut him off, the single word dripping with glacial disdain. He finally released Elisa's arm, but he didn't step away. He stood slightly in front of her, a physical barrier between her and the ruins of her life. "She isn't making a scene," Alexander stated, his voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the crowd. He looked at David, then at Chloe, dissecting them with a single glance. "She is merely acknowledging a profound lack of character." Chloe flushed, her manufactured composure cracking. "Excuse me? You have no idea what you're talking about?" Alexander ignored her entirely. He turned his attention back to Elisa. The storm clouds in his eyes seemed to settle, replaced by an unnerving intensity. He didn't offer pity. He offered a challenge. "You have two choices," Alexander said. His voice meant only for her. "You can stay here and debate the mechanics of a betrayal with people who don't deserve your breath. Or—" he extended a hand, the gesture both an invitation and a command. "Come with me." Elisa stared at the offered hand. It was a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. But the man holding the rope was as unpredictable as the storm itself. She glanced back at David. He looked small, suddenly diminished against the backdrop of the loft and the imposing presence of Alexander Thorne. He looked like a stranger. She looked at Chloe, whose eyes darted nervously between Alexander and David. The friendship, the shared secrets, the late-night confessions. All of it felt cheap, like counterfeit currency she'd been carrying for years. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Elisa placed her hand in Alexander's. His grip was firm, immediate. He didn't pull her. He simply anchored her as she took a step forward. "We're leaving," Alexander announced to the room at large, though his eyes remained fixed on Elisa. He led her through the parting crowd. The whispers followed them, a rustling tide of speculation and shock. Elisa kept her eyes trained on the broad expanse of Alexander's back. The charcoal wool was rough against her bare arm where they briefly brushed. It was a tangible reality in a world that had suddenly become surreal. They reached the heavy oak door of the loft. Alexander pushed it open without breaking stride, ushering her into the cool, quiet hallway of the converted warehouse. The thumping bass was muffled immediately, replaced by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked, releasing her hand as they reached the elevator bank. He pushed the call button, his profile sharp against the dim lighting. "No," Elisa answered honestly. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving a hollow, aching cold in its wake. "But I will be." Alexander turned to look at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before his expression smoothed out. A pragmatic response. I appreciate pragmatism. The elevator arrived with a soft ping. They stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting their stark contrast. Her in the vibrant, slightly crumpled emerald dress, him in the impeccable monochrome armor of his suit. "Why did you do that?" Elisa asked as the door slid shut. The silence in the small space was oppressive, demanding to be filled. "Do what?" Alexander countered, his gaze fixed on the descending floor numbers. "Interfere. You don't know me. You barely know David, even if you are the CEO." "I know enough," Alexander replied cryptically. "I dislike messy situations. Your former partner was creating a mess." "So you stepped in to play janitor?" Elisa asked, a spark of irritation cutting through her shock. She didn't need to be rescued by a corporate overlord who viewed her pain as a logistical inconvenience. Alexander finally looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upwards in a microscopic smile. "I assure you, Elisa, I do not clean up other people's messes unless it serves a purpose." "And what purpose did this serve?" The elevator chimed, announcing the ground floor. Alexander gestured for her to step out first. "That," he said smoothly, "remains to be seen." They walked out into the crisp night air. A sleek, black town car idled at the curb, its engine a low purr. A driver, as impeccably dressed as Alexander, stepped out and opened the rear door. "Where are you going?" Alexander asked, pausing by the open door. Elisa hesitated. The apartment she shared with David was out of the question. The idea of returning to a space filled with his belongings, their shared memories, made her chest tighten. She thought of a hotel, but she hadn't brought a bag. She was adrift. I'm not sure," she admitted, the vulnerability slipping out before she could catch it. Alexander studied her for a long moment. He didn't look pitying, but there was a calculation in his eyes that made her acutely aware of her own fragility. "Get in," he said simply. "I can call a cab," Elisa protested, though the thought of sitting alone in the back of a taxi, marinating in the evening's events, was unappealing. "You could," Alexander agreed. "But you won't. You're in shock, you're shivering, and you have nowhere to go. Get in the car, Elisa." It wasn't a request. It was an assessment of the situation, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Elisa considered arguing. She considered walking away into the night, preserving her independence. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and the exhaustion of the betrayal was catching up to her. She climbed into the plush leather interior of the town car. Alexander slid in beside her, the driver closing the door with a solid thunk. The silence inside the car was absolute, a sanctuary from the chaos she had just left behind. "Drive," Alexander instructed quietly. The car glided away from the curb, leaving the loft, David and Chloe behind in the rearview mirror. Elisa watched the city lights blur past the tinted window. She was in a stranger's car, heading to an unknown destination, her life irrevocably altered. Yet, as she glanced at the stoic profile of the man beside her, she felt a strange, inexplicable sense of safety. The storm had hit, but she wasn't drowning. Not yet. The car journey was a study in silence. Elisa watched the city transition from the bustling, brightly lit downtown to quieter, leafier avenues. She didn't ask where they were going. The exhaustion had settled heavy on her shoulders, muting her curiosity. Alexander, for his part, seemed perfectly content with the quiet, his focus directed out his own window, seemingly lost in thought. When the car finally slowed, it turned onto a private, curved driveway that led to a sleek, modernist glass and steel structure. It wasn't a house. It was an architectural statement, perched on a hill overlooking the city lights. The driver opened the door, and Elisa stepped out, the cool night air biting through her thin dress. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as she looked up at the imposing building. "My home," Alexander said, appearing beside her. He didn't offer a tour guide's enthusiasm, merely a statement of fact. "It's quiet. You can rest here." I shouldn't," Elisa murmured, the impropriety of the situation finally piercing her fog of shock. "I can just go to a hotel. I can call a friend." She stopped herself, the bitter irony of the last option twisting her stomach. Her best friend was currently comforting her ex-boyfriend. "You can do neither of those things effectively right now," Alexander pointed out, his tone logical, devoid of judgment. "You need a neutral space. This is a neutral space. I have several guest rooms. You will have privacy." He walked towards the heavy glass door, pausing when he realized she hadn't followed. He turned back, the glow of the security lights catching the sharp angles of his face. "I am not David, Elisa," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than a shout. "I do not play games." The stark contrast between the two men hit her then. David, with his constant need for reassurance, his easily bruised ego, his subtle manipulations. And Alexander, solid, uncompromising, opaque. She didn't know him, but she believed him. She followed him inside. The interior was exactly as she would have imagined based on the exterior. Minimalist, impeccably clean, and cold. Expansive white walls were adorned with stark, abstract art. The furniture was all low lines and neutral colors. It felt less like a home and more like a high-end gallery. "Mrs. Gable will show you to a room," Alexander said, gesturing slightly as a woman in a neat gray uniform appeared from a hallway. She looked to be in her late 50s, with a kind face and sharp, intelligent eyes. "Good evening, sir," Mrs. Gable said smoothly, as if bringing home a distressed woman in an emerald dress was a nightly occurrence. She turned to Elisa with a warm, professional smile. "Right this way, miss." Elisa looked back at Alexander. He was already shrugging off his suit jacket, his mind seemingly moving on to other things. "Thank you," she managed to say. He paused, looking over his shoulder. "Rest, Elisa. We will deal with the practicalities tomorrow." Mrs. Gable led her to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. It was dominated by a massive, plush bed and a wall of windows offering a panoramic view of the sleeping city. A set of luxurious, oversized pajamas lay folded neatly on the edge of the mattress. "If you need anything, there is a call button by the bed," Mrs. Gable informed her, checking the room with practiced efficiency. "I'll draw a bath for you. The water pressure is excellent." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Elisa said, the gratitude genuine. "This is very kind." The housekeeper paused, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. "Mr. Thorne is a private man, miss. But he's not an unkind one. Try to sleep." Once alone, the reality of the evening crashed over her with the force of a physical blow. Elisa sank onto the edge of the bed, the soft mattress yielding beneath her. She looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror across the room. The emerald dress was wrinkled, her makeup smudged, her eyes wide and haunted. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck. She stood up slowly and walked to the adjoining bathroom. It was a masterpiece of marble and glass, featuring a large, deep, soaking tub that was already filling with steaming, faintly lavender-scented water. She stripped off the dress, letting it pool around her ankles like discarded armor. She stepped into the hot water, groaning softly as the heat seeped into her tense muscles. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of David's hand under Chloe's, the sound of his voice telling her she was making a scene. The tears came then. They weren't noisy, racking sobs, but a silent, relentless stream that burned her cheeks. She cried for the 5 years she had invested, for the future she had planned, and for the agonizing realization that the people she trusted most had viewed her as an obstacle. She stayed in the tub until the water turned tepid, the physical act of crying leaving her hollowed out, empty. She dried off, slipping into the provided pajamas. They were too large, swamping her frame, but the soft silk felt comforting against her skin. She climbed into the massive bed, pulling the thick duvet up to her chin. The city lights twinkled outside the window, a distant galaxy of activity. She was suspended above it all, sequestered in the fortress of the Alpha King, as exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her down into a deep, dreamless sleep. Her last coherent thought was a mix of apprehension and a strange, lingering sense of safety. She was broken, yes, but she was no longer drowning. Sunlight, brutal and unyielding, sliced through the gap in the heavy linen curtains. Elisa woke with a sharp inhale, her hand automatically reaching across the mattress. It met smooth, cool cotton. The sudden absence of David's familiar weight sent a violent jolt through her nervous system, instantly dispelling the lingering fog of sleep. The memory of the previous night, the party, the intertwined hands, the suffocating humiliation, crashed over her in a suffocating wave. She sat up, the oversized silk pajamas slipping off one shoulder. The sprawling guest room, with its pristine white walls and austere modern art, felt like an isolation chamber. She wasn't in her cramped, cozy apartment. She was in the fortress of Alexander Thorne. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted bitter on her tongue. She needed to leave. She needed to reclaim some fragment of control. After a quick shower in the marbled bathroom, she found her emerald dress. Mrs. Gable had somehow cleaned and pressed it while she slept, hanging it neatly on the back of the door. Slipping it on felt like donning the uniform of a defeated soldier. But it was all she had. She navigated the silent, sun-drenched corridors of the house, following the subtle aroma of dark-roasted coffee. It led her to a massive kitchen that looked like it belonged in a culinary magazine. Acres of brushed steel and black marble. Alexander sat at the island. He was no longer in the charcoal suit, but he looked no less formidable in a crisp navy dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle. A tablet rested in front of him, his eyes scanning the screen with a predator's focus. He didn't look up as her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, but his voice broke the silence. "There is coffee in the French press." Mrs. Gable left a plate in the warming drawer. "I shouldn't stay," Elisa said, her voice sounding raspy, fragile in the vast space. She didn't move toward the coffee. She stood near the doorway, hovering on the periphery of his domain. Alexander finally raised his head. In the harsh morning light, his eyes were a piercing, unforgiving gray. He studied her for a long, quiet moment, taking in her defensive posture, the tight set of her jaw, the defensive crossing of her arms. Running away in last night's evening wear is a dramatic exit, but strategically flawed, Alexander noted, his tone entirely conversational. He tapped a finger against his ceramic mug. Sit down, Elisa. Drink some coffee. Your nervous system is currently operating on adrenaline fumes. I am not your employee, Mr. Thorne. She bristled, a defensive spark igniting in her chest. If you were my employee, you would have been at your desk 20 minutes ago. He countered smoothly. Sit. It wasn't a command born of arrogance, but of practical necessity. The sheer rationality of his tone deflated her anger. She crossed the room, pulling out a heavy iron stool opposite him. She poured a cup of coffee, the dark liquid trembling slightly as her hands shook. I need to go to my apartment, she said, staring into the black depths of her mug. I need my things, my laptop, my life. Your apartment is leased under David's name, Alexander stated. It wasn't a question. Elisa's head snapped up. How do you know that? I own the property management company that oversees that building. I own quite a few things. He set his tablet down, folding his hands on the marble counter. And because I own things, I pay very close attention to the people who operate within them. David is a mid-level manager in my logistics division. Did you know that? I knew he worked for Thorne Industries, yes, she said, her confusion mounting. What does that have to do with anything? It has everything to do with why I was at that agonizingly mediocre party last night, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I do not attend employee gatherings, Elisa. I attended last night to observe a man who's been quietly embezzling from my company for the better part of 8 months. The breath punched out of her lungs. Embezzling? David. She thought of his spreadsheets, his neurotic need to split the grocery bill down to the cent, his obsession with rules. That's impossible. He's too careful. He was arrogant, Alexander corrected, a cold smile touching the corner of his mouth. He thought he found a blind spot in the routing algorithms. He was using his promotion to expand the operation. Your friend Chloe works in the auditing firm we contract. A convenient alliance, wouldn't you say? The room seemed to tilt. The betrayal wasn't just a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, intertwined web of deceit. They hadn't just made a fool of her. They had built their new life together on a foundation of theft, using her as a smokescreen of domestic normalcy. Why are you telling me this? Elisa whispered, her hands gripping the coffee mug tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Because ignorance is a vulnerability, Alexander replied softly, the intensity in his eyes locking onto hers. You woke up this morning believing you lost a good man to a sudden mistake. You needed to know you lost a parasite to his own greed. You are grieving an illusion, Elisa. I am simply offering you the clarity of reality. He slid a sleek, silver keycard across the marble island. It stopped an inch from her hand, a suite at the St. Regis. It is paid for the next month. You need a base of operations that is not tainted by his presence. Elisa stared at the card. It was an out, a lifeline. But it felt heavy with unspoken obligations. I don't take charity, Mr. Thorne. I don't give charity, he shot back instantly. I am firing David today. It will be chaotic, and he will attempt to leverage you to soften his landing. I prefer my severances to be clean. Keeping you out of his blast radius serves my interests. Take the card. She looked at the man across from her. The Alpha King, a man who moved chess pieces while others were still learning the rules of checkers. Slowly, her fingers closed over the silver plastic. The lobby of Thorn Industries was a cathedral of glass and steel, designed to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small. Elisa stood near the bank of elevators, clutching her purse tightly against her side. She hadn't gone to the hotel. Instead, she had insisted on coming here. If David was going to face his ruin today, she refused to cower in a luxury suite while it happened. She needed to look him in the eye. Alexander had argued against it, his jaw tight with disapproval. But he had not stopped her. "If you insist on walking into the fire," he had said in the car, "do not complain when you smell like smoke." She spotted him before he saw her. David emerged from a conference room on the mezzanine level, his face a sickly, pallid gray. He was accompanied by 2 massive security guards. He was carrying a small cardboard box. The sight of it, the universal symbol of corporate execution, sent a strange, cold thrill through Elisa's veins. He reached the ground floor, his eyes darting around the lobby like a cornered animal. Then, he saw her. He didn't look remorseful. He looked furious. He shrugged off the security guard's hand and marched across the polished limestone floor toward her. "You," David hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of panic and rage. "You did this. You told him something, didn't you? You couldn't just let things be. You had to ruin my life because you were jealous." Elisa stood her ground, though her heart battered against her ribs. The man standing before her was a stranger. The careful, measured David she had loved was gone, replaced by a desperate, sweating fraud. "I didn't have to say a word, David," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. The acoustics of the massive lobby amplified her quiet tone. "You ruined yourself. You just used me as a prop while you did it. You don't understand anything." He spat, stepping closer, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "I was doing it for us. The promotion, the money. It was all so we could have a better life." "Don't," Elisa said, slicing her hand through the air, the gesture sharp enough to make him blink. "Do not dare weaponize our relationship to justify your theft. You didn't do this for us. And you certainly didn't sleep with my best friend for us." A sharp clatter echoed through the lobby. Chloe had just pushed through the revolving doors, freezing as she took in the scene. David with his cardboard box, the security guards, and Elisa standing tall in the center of it all. Chloe rushed forward, her designer heels clicking frantically. "David, what's going on? Why aren't you answering my texts?" She looked at the box, then at Elisa, her eyes narrowing. "What did you do, Elle?" Before Elisa could answer, the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The low, rhythmic sound of deliberate footsteps echoed from the executive elevator bank. Alexander Thorn bypassed the security perimeter, his presence instantly silencing the murmurs of the passing employees. He didn't look like a CEO checking on a disturbance. He looked like an executioner surveying the scaffold. He stopped a few feet away, entirely ignoring David. His gaze locked onto Chloe. "Ms. Vance," Alexander said, his voice a smooth, lethal purr. "I believe your firm requires its auditors to maintain a strict code of ethics. Assisting an employee in bearing fraudulent routing numbers through intentional oversight constitutes a rather severe breach of that code." Chloe's flawless complexion drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Thorn. I'm just here to see my boyfriend. Your boyfriend is currently awaiting a conversation with the authorities regarding corporate grand larceny," Alexander replied, his face a mask of absolute indifference. Your firm's managing partner has already been notified of your involvement. I believe you will find your own cardboard box waiting for you at your office." Chloe gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. She looked at David, searching for the confident man who had promised her the world the night before. But David was staring at the floor, utterly defeated. "This isn't fair," Chloe whispered, tears finally pooling in her eyes. Real ones this time, born of self-pity rather than manufactured sympathy. Fairness is a concept invented by the weak to negotiate with the strong, Alexander stated coldly. He finally turned his attention to David. "Escort him out. If he steps foot on this property again, have him arrested for trespassing." The guards moved in, flanking David. As he was led toward the revolving doors, he looked back at Elisa one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only a bitter, hollow resentment. Elisa watched them leave, the heavy glass doors spinning to a halt behind them. The silence in the lobby was deafening. She felt a sudden, profound emptiness. The anger that had fueled her morning evaporated, leaving her exhausted and untethered. She swayed slightly, the adrenaline crash hitting her with physical force. A warm, heavy hand settled on the small of her back, the touch radiating a steadying heat through the thin fabric of her dress. "Breathe, Elisa," Alexander murmured, stepping close enough that she could smell the clean, sharp scent of his cologne. "The rot has been cut out. Now, we rebuild." She looked up at him. The harsh angles of his face softened slightly by the filtered lobby light. He wasn't offering comfort. He was offering a foundation. "Why we?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Alexander's thumb brushed lightly, almost imperceptibly, against her spine. "Because, as I mentioned, I dislike waste. And you, Elisa, have entirely too much potential to be left in the ruins." 2 weeks later, the St. Regis suite felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Elisa stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain blur the city skyline into a smear of gray and gold. The silence of the room was oppressive. She had spent 14 days dismantling a 5-year life, canceling joint credit cards, untangling phone plans, blocking numbers. David had tried calling from unknown numbers a dozen times, leaving frantic, demanding voicemails that vacillated between begging for money for a lawyer and blaming her for his impending criminal charges. She deleted them all. But survival wasn't the same as living. Her freelance graphic design business had stalled. Her creative well was entirely bone dry. The sharp buzz of her cell phone broke the quiet. The caller ID flashed a single, ominous name. Thorne. She answered on the second ring. "Hello?" "You are stagnating." Alexander's voice came through the speaker, crisp and devoid of greeting. Elisa bristled, her posture straightening instantly. "Good afternoon to you too, Mr. Thorne. And I am not stagnating. I am recovering. Recovery is an active process, not a passive state of decay in a hotel room." He countered smoothly. The faint sound of a keyboard clicking echoed in the background. "My marketing department is overhauling the branding for our new European logistics division. The current mock-ups are uninspired, derivative garbage. I need a fresh perspective. Your portfolio suggests you are capable of providing it." Elisa blinked, caught off guard. "You've looked at my portfolio? I research everyone who enters my orbit," he replied, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "I do not offer charity, Elisa. This is a freelance contract. It pays market rate. You will report directly to me, as I do not trust my current marketing director's judgment. Can you be at the office in an hour?" It wasn't a request. It was a lifeline disguised as a demand. "Give me an hour and a half," she said, a spark of long dormant energy igniting in her chest. "It's raining. Don't be late," he said, and the line went dead. 85 minutes later, Elisa stepped off the private executive elevator on the top floor of Thorne Industries. The air up here was different. Thinner, quieter, humming with an invisible current of power. She bypassed the empty reception desk, guided by the soft glow of light spilling from the corner office. The door was ajar. Alexander was standing behind his massive mahogany desk, staring out at the rain-lashed city, a phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking rapid, flawless French, his tone sharply reprimanding. He didn't turn around as she entered, but he gestured vaguely toward a large glass table littered with blueprints and design boards. Elisa set her wet umbrella by the door and approached the table. The designs were, as he had said, garbage. They were safe, corporate, and entirely devoid of personality. She pulled a red marker from her bag and began making notes, the familiar rhythm of the work soothing her frayed nerves. "They lack aggression," Alexander said suddenly, ending his call and stepping up beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. "They lack humanity," Elisa corrected, tapping the red marker against a particularly bland logo concept. "You're expanding into Europe. You can't just be an American monolith. You have to look like a partner, not an invader. These colors are too cold. They scream efficiency but whisper ruthless." Alexander looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I am ruthless, Elisa. Your company is," she countered, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But your clients don't need to be reminded of that on every letterhead. You need to sell reliability, not dominance." Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. The drumming of the rain against the glass seemed to amplify the quiet. Alexander didn't blink. He was studying her, dissecting her words, measuring her defiance. "You are not intimidated by me anymore," he observed quietly. "I've survived a worse betrayal than a bad logo design, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I don't have the energy left to be afraid of you." A microscopic shift occurred in Alexander's expression. The rigid, icy armor he wore seemed to fracture for a fraction of a second. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder, to pick up one of her red-marked boards. As he leaned over, his jacket fell open slightly. Elisa's eyes darted to his chest, catching a glimpse of a silver chain resting against his throat. Tucked beneath his shirt was a small, worn silver ring. It wasn't a wedding band. It looked old, slightly battered. It was a fiercely intimate detail on a man who presented himself as entirely bulletproof. He caught her looking. He didn't cover it up, but his jaw tightened. "My father's," Alexander said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its corporate edge. "He built a company much like this one. He lost it because he trusted his best friend. His partner bled the accounts dry and left him with the debts. My father didn't survive the shame." The pieces clicked together in Elisa's mind with deafening clarity. His absolute hatred for David's embezzlement. His instantaneous, visceral reaction to the betrayal at the party. He hadn't just been playing the benevolent dictator. He had recognized his own ghosts in her shattered life. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling horribly inadequate. Alexander set the board down. He turned to face her fully, the proximity suddenly suffocatingly intense. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an unspoken understanding that bridged the vast gap between them. "I do not want your pity, Elisa," he murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "I want your defiance. I want your edge. Do not let what they did to you file down your sharp parts. Use them." He stepped back, the invisible tether between them snapping taut, then releasing. The Alpha King was back, his armor firmly in place. "Redesign the entire campaign," he ordered, walking back to his desk. "Have a preliminary mock-up on my desk by Monday morning." Elisa looked at the mess of corporate designs, then back at the man who had just handed her a piece of his soul disguised as a business lesson. She gripped the red marker tighter. "You'll have it by Sunday night," she promised. The city was cloaked in the quiet darkness of a Sunday night when Elisa stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor. The sprawling office was eerily silent, the usual chaotic hum of corporate warfare replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. The only illumination came from the emergency track lighting and the bright, spilling square of light emanating from Alexander's office. Elisa carried a large black leather portfolio case. It was heavy, not just with the thick presentation boards, but with the weight of her own resurrected ambition. She had barely slept. She had existed on black tea, adrenaline, and a fierce, burning need to prove that her talent hadn't been packed away in a cardboard box alongside David's career. She paused at the open doorway. Alexander was at his desk, bathed in the cool light of dual monitors. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his reading glasses gave his sharp features a slightly academic, albeit dangerous, edge. "You're early," he said, not looking away from the screen. "It is only 10 o'clock. You had until midnight." "I work better when I have momentum," Elisa replied, stepping into the room. She hoisted the portfolio onto the expansive glass meeting table and unzipped it. "And I wanted to ensure you had time to digest this before the Monday morning briefing." Alexander finally looked up. He took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose in a rare display of fatigue. He stood, his imposing frame casting a long shadow as he crossed the room. He didn't speak as he took his place beside her, his proximity immediately changing the air pressure in the room. Elisa began laying out the boards. She hadn't just tweaked the colors, she had entirely dismantled the previous marketing strategy. The old campaign focused on speed and dominance, Elisa explained, her voice steady, confident in a way it hadn't been for weeks. It felt like an invasion. Europe doesn't want an American corporate giant to conquer them. They want a partner to facilitate their own growth. She pointed to the centerpiece, a deep, rich indigo and burnished gold logo, featuring interlocking geometric shapes that suggested bridges rather than arrows. "We soften the edges without losing the strength," she continued, her hands moving over the mock-ups. "The imagery focuses on the people handling the logistics, not just the machines. We sell trust. We sell the handshake at the end of the delivery, not just the tracking number." Silence descended upon the office. It was a heavy, evaluating silence. Alexander leaned over the table, bracing his weight on his hands. He studied the boards with the same predatory focus he used to dissect financial reports. 1 minute passed, then 2. Elisa forced herself to remain perfectly still. She didn't fidget. She didn't offer nervous qualifiers to fill the void. She let her work speak. Finally, Alexander straightened. He turned his head, looking down at her. The stormy gray of his eyes was unreadable. You ignored every single guideline my marketing director laid out in the initial brief. He stated quietly. Your marketing director's guidelines were born of fear and a lack of imagination. Elisa countered, refusing to back down. You hired me because you knew the current strategy was a failure. I fixed it. A slow, genuine smile broke across Alexander's face. It wasn't his usual cold smirk. It was a devastatingly handsome, appreciative curve of his mouth that completely transformed his austere features. Yes, he murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. You did. He reached out, his long fingers trailing over the edge of the central presentation board. It is brilliant, Elisa. It is precisely what the division needs. You have captured the exact frequency of the market. A wave of profound relief washed over her, followed immediately by a surge of pure, undiluted triumph. It was the first victory she had claimed entirely for herself since the night her world collapsed. Alexander walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured 2 measures of amber liquid into heavy tumblers and offered one to her. To momentum, he toasted softly. Elisa took the glass, their fingers brushing briefly. The heat of his skin sent a sudden, startling jolt up her arm. To new foundations. She took a sip, the whiskey burning a pleasant, grounding path down her throat. Alexander watched her, the intensity returning to his gaze. There is a gala on Friday, he said suddenly, setting his glass down. A formal launch for the European division. The board will be there, alongside key investors and media. I will be presenting this campaign. I'm sure they will love it, Elisa said, taking a step back as the intimacy of the quiet office suddenly felt overwhelming. They will, Alexander agreed. He stepped forward, closing the distance she had just created. And the architect of that campaign needs to be there to receive the credit. You will accompany me, Elisa? As my guest. It wasn't a corporate directive. It was something entirely different. Something that made her pulse flutter frantically against her throat. She looked up at the Alpha King, seeing the man who had pulled her from the wreckage, and slowly she nodded. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of glittering chandeliers, cascading orchids, and the quiet, dangerous hum of immense wealth. Elisa stood near a towering column of white marble, a flute of champagne held loosely in her hand. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that draped perfectly over her frame, a stark contrast to the vulnerable woman in the wrinkled emerald dress a month ago. She felt different. She felt anchored. Across the room, Alexander was holding court with a circle of European investors. He was in his element, radiating absolute authority in a bespoke tuxedo. Yet, despite the demanding audience, his eyes sought her out every few minutes, tracking her presence in the room with a subtle, reassuring possessiveness. The launch presentation had been a staggering success. When Alexander had credited the entire rebranding to the visionary talent of Miss Elisa Vance, the applause had been thunderous. She had secured a lucrative, long-term consulting contract before the appetizer course was even cleared. Enjoying the view from the top? The voice, thin and laced with venom, cut through the sophisticated string quartet playing in the background. Elisa didn't startle. She turned slowly, her expression placid. Chloe stood a few feet away. The change in her former best friend was shocking. Chloe's usually flawless hair was slightly frizzy, and her dress, while expensive, looked a season out of date and slightly too tight. The confident, condescending aura she had worn at David's party was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, brittle energy. "Chloe," Elisa said evenly, her voice devoid of any emotional inflection. "How did you get in here?" "I still have a few connections," Chloe snapped, glancing nervously toward the security detail near the doors. She took a step closer, her scent a cloying mix of anxiety and cheap perfume. "Look at you, playing the corporate princess. Did you really have to ruin everything, Elle?" Elisa took a slow sip of her champagne. "I didn't ruin anything, Chloe. I simply stopped holding up the scenery for your lies." "I lost my job," Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. "They fired me with cause. No other firm will touch me because of the fraud association. David is facing federal charges, and he completely drained my savings trying to hire a defense attorney before he skipped town. A month ago, the news of David fleeing would have shattered her. Now, it merely felt like a headline about a stranger in a distant country. That sounds like a very difficult situation," Elisa said, her tone clinically detached. "But it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with you." Chloe desperately grabbed Elisa's wrist. Her grip was tight, manic. "You have his ear, Thorne. You need to tell him to back off. Tell him to drop the civil suit against me. Please, Elle, for old time's sake. We were sisters." Elisa looked down at the hand clutching her wrist. She remembered that hand resting on David's arm. She remembered the diamond earrings. With a calm, fluid motion, Elisa twisted her arm, breaking Chloe's grip entirely. "Do not ever touch me again," Elisa commanded, her voice dropping to a low, icy register that she didn't know she possessed. It sounded startlingly like Alexander. Chloe shrank back, her eyes wide with shock. "We were never sisters, Chloe," Elisa continued, stepping forward, forcing the other woman to retreat. "A sister doesn't build her happiness on the destruction of mine. You made a calculation. You thought I was weak, and you thought David was a winning ticket. You were wrong on both counts." "Elisa, please." "This conversation is over," Elisa interrupted, her voice ringing with finality. "If you do not leave this ballroom immediately, I will signal security. And given Mr. Thorne's disposition, I imagine your exit will be exceedingly public and highly unpleasant." Chloe stared at her, searching for the forgiving, compliant friend she used to know. Finding nothing but cold, polished steel, Chloe let out a fractured sob, turned, and fled toward the service exit. Elisa watched her go, a profound sense of closure washing over her. The final ghost had been exorcised. "You handled that with remarkable efficiency." Alexander materialized beside her, his presence a sudden, warm weight in the cool air of the ballroom. He handed her a fresh glass of champagne, his eyes following the path Chloe had taken. "I learned from the best," Elisa said. Looking up at him, Alexander's gaze shifted down to her, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I was prepared to intervene, but I realized halfway across the room that you had the situation entirely under control. The armor suits you, Elisa." "It isn't armor," she corrected softly, feeling the steady rhythm of her own heart. "It's just me." In the wreckage of a 5-year betrayal, Elisa found more than just an escape. She found her own formidable strength. The tragedy that could have broken her instead became the crucible that forged a new, undeniable power. Alexander Thorne didn't just offer her a way out. He offered her a mirror to see the royalty she possessed all along. Sometimes, the most devastating endings are merely the universe clearing the stage for a much grander beginning. If you were captivated by Elisa's journey from heartbreak to triumph and the slow burn romance with the Alpha King, please hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a powerful comeback, and don't forget to subscribe for more dramatic, cinematic romance stories.